Water doesn't argue with gravity. It just finds the lowest ground and goes there, without ever deciding to. Pour it on flat ground, and it spreads thin, going nowhere in particular. Pour that same water into a riverbed, and it carves a path. Watch what water does after enough time passes. That path gets a little deeper every single time water runs through it. Hundreds of years later, water still follows the exact same route without anyone telling it to. Your own mind behaves a lot like that second one. A thought you've repeated, a fear you've rehearsed 100 times, an old story you keep telling yourself in the quiet moments. None of that disappears once it's said. It carves a channel a little deeper each time. And once that channel is deep enough, new thoughts stop looking for a different route. They just fall into the one already there. Your life 5 years from now isn't waiting somewhere for you to arrive. It's being built right now by the decisions you keep repeating this week. The future doesn't show up all at once, wrapped and ready. It arrives disguised as today's habits, over and over, until one day it's simply the life you're living. We often treat our circumstances as the whole problem. New job, new house, more money, and surely the water will find a better path on its own. It usually doesn't, not without help. The new path gets dug on purpose, by someone willing to pick up a shovel before the water ever arrives. That's what this video actually is. Not a speech you'll forget by tomorrow morning. A shovel. It's strange how one sentence someone heard at 12 can still be making decisions for them at 30. I'm just not a morning person. I always quit things halfway through. Small sentences like that rarely feel dangerous at first, but every time they get repeated, the channel gets a little deeper, until the sentence isn't really an opinion anymore. It just feels like fact. Rivers do change course sometimes, though. It takes real effort on purpose, again and again, until the new path finally runs deeper than the old one. Nobody carved the old channel in a single afternoon either. It took years, one small repeated thought at a time, which means the same slow method that built it can also unbuild it. A dry riverbed still holds the shape of water, even years after the water stopped flowing. Walk along one sometime and the old path is obvious, carved right into the rock, waiting for rain that hasn't come in a long time. That's what an old belief looks like too most days. Not active exactly, just shaped and ready to fill back up the moment something reminds you of it. Nobody hands you a map of your own mental channels either. You find them the hard way, usually by noticing the same argument, the same excuse, the same quiet giving up, showing up again in a slightly different outfit. It's easy to assume each situation is new, unrelated to the last one. Often it's the same channel, wearing a different name. Today, one clear way to start digging. A way to test whether a belief you've carried for years was ever actually true. Then 4 more, one at a time, each one cutting a slightly different kind of channel. If you're ready to dig instead of just wishing the water moved differently, hit that like button now. Drop a comment with one word for the old path you're most ready to leave behind. Subscribe if this is your first time here, and stay through the whole thing. The first idea only really lands once you understand what comes right after it. Type your answer below. One word for the belief you're ready to leave behind. My mind is trainable. Number 1. Reality flip. Live as if your limiting belief is already false. Burn your hand on a stove once, and your mind remembers that stove for years. Not because it decided to, because pain is an efficient teacher, and it doesn't wait for your permission before leaving a mark. Beliefs get built the exact same way, minus the pain most of the time. Say, I'm not disciplined enough times, quietly, to yourself, and your mind starts treating it less like an opinion and more like a fact carved into the wall. The mistake starts much earlier than you'd expect, though. It's not the belief itself doing the damage. It's what happens after the belief moves in. Your mind stops checking. It stops asking whether the sentence was ever actually true. Instead, it starts hunting for anything that agrees with it and quietly looking away from anything that doesn't. A missed deadline gets filed as proof. A late start to the morning gets filed as proof. Meanwhile, the mornings you did get up early, the tasks you did finish on time, those get treated like exceptions, not evidence. None of us catches this while it's happening. That's the part nobody notices. We just keep collecting support for a story we never actually chose, the way you stop hearing a hum in a room after enough time in it. Over 100 years ago, a doctor named Alfred Adler kept running into patients convinced something was permanently wrong with them. Too weak, too awkward, unlovable in their own private math. Arguing with them rarely worked. Logic just bounced off, the same way a closing statement bounces off a jury that already decided the verdict before the trial began. So Adler tried something sideways instead. For short stretches, sometimes just an afternoon, he asked patients to act exactly as if the belief were already false. What he saw next surprised him. Patients who acted as if they already had the confidence they swore they lacked, some of them slowly built that confidence for real. Not through some sudden flash of insight, through evidence. Their own actions kept handing them small, undeniable proof the old case wasn't holding up anymore. That's the whole idea behind this technique. Beliefs rarely collapse in one dramatic movie moment. They get slowly outvoted instead. One inconvenient piece of evidence at a time, until the story simply can't hold its shape. A single vote rarely decides an election on its own. It takes thousands of them, quietly stacking up, before a result finally becomes undeniable. Beliefs get elected and unelected in the mind the same slow way. No single moment flips the outcome. It's the accumulation that does it, one small ballot at a time, long after anyone stopped watching closely. A man spent 10 years certain he was terrible at speaking in front of people. Every invitation declined. Every decline, more proof the belief was right. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday, someone pulled him into a short meeting with almost no warning at all. 2 minutes of talking. Nothing polished, nothing impressive, nothing happened, really. He didn't discover some hidden gift. He just survived it. Sat back down. The meeting moved on to the next item, but something quite shifted that day. Because one small, unplanned moment had just started outweighing 10 years of assumption. Muscle memory works on a similar principle, if it helps to picture it that way. Learn to type, and eventually your fingers stop needing conscious direction. Not because you argued your fingers into it, because repetition built the pathway. Beliefs get built the same way, not through clever self-talk, through repeated action, until the mind treats it as automatic. Here's where the shift actually happens. Stop asking, does this match what I already believe about myself? Ask instead, what would someone without this belief do right now? Then do exactly that, without waiting for permission or the right mood to arrive first. One day of this won't erase 20 years of an old belief, to be fair about it. But strung together across a week, a month, the small contradictions start outpacing the old case faster than it can keep up. Eventually, the story simply can't hold together. It updates, or it falls apart under its own weight. The first few tries at this usually feel a little fake, like performing in front of an audience that isn't even watching. That feeling fades quicker than most people expect, usually by the third or fourth attempt, once the performance starts feeling less like acting and more like practice. An actor rehearsing a role often says the same thing about the first few run-throughs. Stiff, self-conscious, aware of every word as a line rather than a thought. Somewhere around the fifth or sixth rehearsal, the lines stop sounding like lines. They start sounding like the character actually thinking them. The words never changed, only the familiarity did. Try this tonight, quietly, without announcing it to anyone. Write down one belief that's been running your life for years. Then write one sentence. What would a person without that belief do tomorrow morning? Not next month. Tomorrow morning. Then go do that one specific thing. The world won't notice a thing, but you will, because you're the only witness sitting in on this particular case. This works on the small, quiet beliefs too, not only the dramatic ones. I never finish books. I'm bad at keeping in touch. These rarely get questioned, since they feel too minor to bother examining. But minor paths still carve just as deep, over enough time, and they're often the easiest ones to redirect first, simply because there's less resistance built up behind them. A jar sits on a shelf for years, labeled once, a long time ago, by someone who barely thought about it. Nobody checks the label again after that first day. It just gets trusted quietly, the way old labels always do. Most beliefs sit exactly like that jar. Nobody's opened the lid in years to see if what's inside still matches what the label claims. You've probably noticed one already, just reading this. What's the sentence you heard once and have been quietly repeating ever since? Give yourself permission to start small here. Not the biggest, scariest belief on day one, something modest instead, almost embarrassingly ordinary. Test the method there first. Once it's worked on something small, a bigger belief later on feels far less intimidating. A missed deadline, a quiet comment from a teacher years ago, a single bad presentation in a job nobody remembers anymore. Small moments like these get filed away, and the filing rarely stops on its own. Someone has to reach in and pull the file back out on purpose and check whether it still holds up. It usually doesn't. Not once you actually look. Before you scroll on, put this where you'll actually see it again. Write it in the comments. I am today's evidence. Number 2, constraint training. Limit yourself to unlock creativity. Two chefs get handed the exact same ingredients. One gets 3 hours, the other gets 30 minutes. Guess who plates something more interesting? It's easy to assume the chef with more time wins this one. Usually it's the other chef. Hand someone endless time and endless choices, and something strange happens. Nothing does. Hand that same person a wall to push against, and the wall starts doing half the thinking on its own. An economist named Herbert Simon spent years studying exactly this, under a term he called bounded rationality. What he found suggested, though it didn't fully prove, that human choices don't actually improve with more options. Past a certain point, they get worse, because a mind wasn't built to weigh infinite possibilities and still choose sharply among them. Call this small tool the friction test. On purpose, shrink your own options until the shrinking itself starts doing the creative work. Cut your usual time on a task in half and watch the unnecessary steps disappear on their own, simply because the clock is forcing the issue. Take a decision you've circled for weeks and force an answer within 60 seconds. Chances are it lands close to whatever you'd have reached after 3 anxious weeks anyway, minus the 3 anxious weeks. Spend 1 full day solving problems only with what's already within arm's reach. Nothing new, nothing bought, nothing borrowed. Your mind starts finding uses for objects it's been ignoring for years, faster than you'd expect. A songwriter with absolutely no rules at all can sit for weeks with nothing finished, because there are simply too many directions available. Give that same person 1 small rule, 3 chords, 1 ordinary object in the room, and ideas start showing up fast. Not because the rule made things easier in some magic sense. The rule gave their mind a wall, and a mind knows exactly what to do with a wall. A free afternoon meant for getting some work done usually gets spent deciding what to even start with. 45 minutes with 1 task picked in advance works differently. The limit makes the decision so your mind doesn't have to keep negotiating with itself. We often treat freedom as automatically better than limits. More time, more choices, more resources. Surely that produces something stronger. But a mind facing endless options spends real energy just scanning through them, quietly, before any actual work begins. That scanning is exhausting, and it drains you without announcing itself. Remove the options, and there's nothing left to scan. The mind skips straight to building. A buffet leaves most people less satisfied than a single well-made plate, oddly enough. Too many choices, and the meal becomes about sampling instead of actually eating. A single plate, chosen carefully in advance, tends to get finished and enjoyed in a way the buffet rarely manages. The same principle keeps showing up, plate after plate, choice after choice, in places that have nothing to do with food at all. Pick one day a week and complete one task using half your usual time or half your usual resources. Not because rushing beats patience, because the habit teaches your mind that limits aren't punishment. They're a tool you can pick up on purpose whenever choices start feeling like too much weight to carry. Over time, this changes how unexpected limits land too. A tight deadline, a smaller budget than hoped for, a tool that suddenly disappears. It stops registering as disaster because you've already practiced treating limits as useful instead of something to resent. Musicians who grew up without much equipment often talk about this without realizing they're describing a principle. One guitar, no effects pedals, a bedroom with thin walls that meant playing quietly or not at all. Some of the most interesting sounds in music history came out of rooms exactly like that, not despite the limits, but because of them. A constraint aimed at nothing, to be fair, is just an obstacle. If it doesn't point towards something you actually care about, you're just making life harder for no reason. The goal was never suffering. The goal is energy, redirected somewhere that matters. There's a difference between a fence and a wall worth noticing here. A wall stops movement entirely. A fence just marks a boundary, and inside that boundary, movement happens faster, not slower, because there's no wandering into open space, wondering where to go next. The friction test is closer to a fence than a wall. It marks an edge. It doesn't lock a door. Where have you been drowning in options lately? Career direction. What to cook tonight? Which project gets your attention first? Cut it in half, arbitrarily if you have to, and notice what your mind does with what's left. A closet full of clothes and still nothing to wear. Anyone who stood in front of one knows the feeling. Too many options quietly become the same thing as no options at all, because choosing among 50 things takes real effort. The same kind of effort that could have gone toward getting dressed and moving on with the day. Cut that closet down to 10 pieces and something strange happens. Getting dressed stops being a decision. It becomes a formality. Nothing lost except the exhausting scanning that never actually helped in the first place. Let's see how many of you actually mean it. Comment this one and prove it this week. Limits build me. Number 3. Perspective roulette. See your life through 5 different eyes. A man sits alone in a room, furious. Not at anyone specific, just furious the way a day gone sideways one too many times tends to leave someone. Then he imagines a stranger watching him through the window. Someone with zero context, zero history, just observing a man alone, angry at something invisible. The anger gets smaller, not gone, smaller. That man was Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor, and he wrote versions of this exact exercise into his own private notebooks nearly 2,000 years ago. He wasn't avoiding his feelings. He was trying to actually see them, and seeing clearly usually takes a little distance first. Call this perspective roulette. Spin the same problem through a series of unfamiliar seats until one of them shows you something the others couldn't. Pick one unresolved situation right now, something real, small enough to actually work with. Walk it through 5 lenses, slowly, one at a time. The stranger's eyes first. Someone who's never met you, watching this unfold from across the street. None of your history attached. Stripped of your own self-judgment. Does the problem still look as large as it felt from inside your own head? The mentor's eyes next. Someone whose judgment you genuinely trust, considering this exact issue. What would they actually say, weighing their own priorities instead of your worry? The future self, 10 years out. Someone who's already lived through whatever comes next, who already knows how this chapter ends. What would they want you to notice right now, something you're currently standing too close to see? The opponent's eyes, if another person's involved here. Not to excuse bad behavior, just to occupy the internal logic that got them where they are. Almost nobody casts themselves as the villain of their own story. What logic are they running on? Two witnesses to the same accident often describe completely different versions of what happened, not because one of them is lying, but because each one stood in a different spot, noticed different details, carried a different set of assumptions into the moment. Courts deal with this constantly. Most people never think to apply the same idea to their own arguments, assuming instead that their version is simply the version rather than one angle among several. The historian's eyes. Finally, someone writing about this exact moment a century from now, zero personal stake, describing it as a small data point inside a much older pattern. Fear of change maybe, fear of judgment, an old human story wearing new clothes. By the fifth lens, the situation usually hasn't physically changed at all. Your relationship to it has. A coworker sends a short, blunt message, and it ruins the rest of someone's afternoon. From their own seat, it feels personal, like disrespect. Try the stranger's eyes on that same message for a moment. Someone with zero background reading those same words. Suddenly it just reads like a person in a hurry. Nothing more. The words never changed, only the seat changed. This isn't about finding the one correct seat and discarding the rest. It's building the habit of checking more than one before deciding how you feel about something. Most reactions come from whichever seat someone happens to be sitting in that day, without ever noticing other seats were available the whole time. Not every lens fits every problem either. The stranger's eyes tend to work well on anything that feels bigger than it probably is. The future self tends to work well on anything that feels urgent today, but won't matter much a year from now. Learning which lens fits which problem takes some practice, but that practice becomes a quiet skill of its own, one you'll eventually use almost without thinking about it. A single argument can look completely different an hour later, once the anger has drained out of the room. Nothing about the argument changed. The person replaying it changed slightly just by letting time pass. Perspective roulette does on purpose what time usually does by accident. It just doesn't make you wait an hour to get there. Try this on something specific this week. A stalled decision, a quiet fear you've been circling without naming out loud. Notice which lens shifted your thinking the most. That's probably the one your instincts have been avoiding on purpose. A photograph looks completely different depending on where the camera stood. Same room, same moment, same people. Move the camera 3 feet to the left and the whole story the photo tells changes with it. Nobody staged anything differently. The camera just stood somewhere else. Most people never move the camera on their own problems. They stand in the same spot, taking the same shot over and over, and wonder why the picture never changes. It won't. Not until someone actually walks over and moves it. Number 4. Sensory deprivation sprints. Train focus in the dark. Turn off the lights. That's most of the exercise right there. We often fight for focus by fighting noise, notifications, conversations. A world constantly asking for its next slice of attention. There's a different route available. Instead of fighting through the noise, remove it almost entirely. Some athletes have used a version of this for years, blocking visual input so the body reacts on trained instinct instead of conscious hesitation. The principle isn't limited to sports though. Pick a task that actually requires thought. Go somewhere dark, blinds shut, or close your eyes if the task allows it. 15 minutes on a timer. Phone in another room, not just face down nearby. No music. Nothing but the task and the dark. The first few minutes tend to feel uncomfortable, and there's no point pretending otherwise. A mind used to constant stimulation scrambles for something, anything, to fill the silence. That's normal. Push through it instead of reaching for relief. For many people, somewhere around minute 5 or 6, the mental noise starts to settle. Not on some fixed schedule and not for everyone. Often enough to notice, though. If total darkness feels like too much to start with, try a gentler version first. Sit somewhere quiet. Dim the lights instead of switching them off. Close your eyes for 5 minutes. Phone left in another room. Don't aim your thoughts anywhere specific yet. Just notice how loud your own mind sounds once the outside noise gets taken away. Most people are surprised by how much mental noise was actually there the whole time, running quietly underneath everything else. Stretch it slowly once the shorter version feels normal. 10 minutes, then 15. Add a real task once you're ready, something that genuinely needs your full attention. A large share of what your brain processes every second comes through your eyes, even when you're not deliberately looking at anything. Just having your eyes open in an ordinary room means your brain is constantly scanning for movement, checking for anything new. Close your eyes or sit in the dark, and that scanning job switches off completely. All that freed up energy has to go somewhere. Usually, it goes straight toward whatever task you've handed it, assuming you handed it something at all. This tends to feel harder for anyone who spends most of the day staring at screens. A mind used to constant visual input notices the sudden absence almost immediately, and it can feel unsettling at first, even a little boring. That reaction usually fades within the first few sessions. Give it a fair week before deciding whether it works for you. Pilots training for instrument flying sometimes practice with limited or blacked-out vision on purpose, learning to trust the instruments in front of them instead of what their eyes think they're seeing. The exercise sounds unrelated to sitting quietly in a dark room at home, but it comes from the same idea. Remove one kind of input, and the mind gets sharper at using what's left. Run these 3 or 4 times this week, even briefly. Pay attention to the strange, lingering quiet that tends to follow for an hour or 2 afterward. Attention remembering, briefly, what it feels like to hold just one thing at a time. A library reading room has a particular quality to it that most workplaces don't. Not silence exactly, since pages turn and chairs shift. Something about the low light and the absence of ringing phones seems to invite a kind of focus that's hard to find anywhere else. People have known this for centuries without needing a study to confirm it. The dark room exercise borrows the same instinct, just stripped down to its simplest possible version. Nothing changed on the surface. At least nothing anyone watching would notice. The timer stopped. The room lights came back on. Someone probably checked their phone within the first 10 seconds. But something in the noise had gone quiet for a while first. And that's the part worth repeating. What's one task you've been avoiding that might actually get easier after 15 minutes in the dark? A room goes quiet the second the television clicks off. Not silent exactly. There's still the hum of a refrigerator somewhere, a car passing outside. But the quiet feels enormous compared to a second ago, simply because something loud just left the room. That's roughly what the first few minutes of darkness feel like too. Enormous, almost too quiet, until the ears and the mind both adjust and realize nothing's actually missing. Just something that used to fill the space, gone for a little while. Try the 15 minutes first, then come back and tell me. Silence sharpens me. Number 5. Paradox thinking. Hold 2 opposites at once. A writer named F. Scott Fitzgerald once wrote a line that's outlasted most of his novels. The test of a first-rate mind, he said, is holding 2 opposite ideas at the same time and still functioning normally, not resolving them, not picking a winner, just holding both and moving forward anyway. We often do the opposite by instinct. A contradiction appears, and the mind rushes to collapse it into one side or the other, because holding both at once feels unstable, almost dishonest, even when it isn't. Gratitude and ambition, held together, look like they should cancel out. How can someone be thankful and dissatisfied at the same time? They don't cancel, though. Gratitude without ambition tends to turn into complacency over time. Ambition without gratitude tends to turn into something close to misery. Held together, each one keeps the other's worst tendency in check. A harder pairing. Planning carefully for the future while fully accepting the plan might fall apart anyway. Treated as either or, someone is either a planner or someone who goes with the flow. The stronger version isn't a compromise between those two. It's full commitment to the plan in one hand, full acceptance of its possible collapse in the other, held at the same time, neither one quietly loosening its grip on the other. Rigid thinking, forcing every contradiction toward one resolved answer, tends to produce fragile decisions. Real situations are rarely clean. They're layered, often contradictory, full of things simultaneously true and inconvenient for each other. A mind trained only to pick sides tends to snap the moment reality refuses a tidy answer. Bridges are built to bend slightly in strong wind, on purpose, by engineers who understand something most of us forget in our own lives. A structure that refuses to move at all tends to break under pressure that a flexible one would have simply absorbed. Rigidity looks like strength, right up until the moment it isn't. A mind practiced in holding paradox doesn't snap the same way. It bends. It sits with the tension instead of resolving it early, and the better decision tends to become visible only once that tension's been held long enough to actually look at. Pick one contradiction quietly avoided this week: loving someone and being frustrated with them, wanting stability and craving change, feeling proud of how far you've come and still hungry for more anyway. Instead of picking a side, write both truths down, side by side, and sit with them a few minutes without deciding which one wins. That stillness feels unsettling at first. Then, a little later, it stops feeling unstable. It starts feeling honest. Loving a job and feeling completely drained by it is one more pairing worth sitting with. Most people assume they have to pick one description or the other. Both can be true together without erasing each other. Admitting both at once tends to lead somewhere clearer than picking just one side ever could. Loving the work shows what's actually worth protecting. Admitting the exhaustion shows what actually needs to change. This takes practice, mostly because it goes against how many of us were raised to think. A clear, single answer often gets treated as strength, and sitting with uncertainty gets treated as weakness. This flips that. Holding two honest truths at once, without collapsing them, takes more strength than picking the easy side, even though it doesn't look as impressive from the outside. A parent can be proud of a child leaving home and heartbroken about it in the exact same breath. Nobody needs to explain that one. Most people recognize it the moment it's said, because they've either felt it themselves or watched someone else live through it. That's really what paradox thinking is asking for, over and over. Not a clever trick. Just permission to feel two true things without forcing one of them to leave the room. The strength is quieter here. It tends to hold up better under real pressure than a confident answer built on only half the truth. A tightrope walker doesn't lean fully left or fully right. Leaning hard either way is exactly how someone falls. Balance lives in the middle, in the tension between two directions pulling at once, neither one winning outright. Paradox thinking works the same way. The two truths pull against each other, and the pulling itself is what keeps a person upright. Pick your two truths, then drop this in the comments so I know you sat with it. I hold both truths. 5 ideas, side by side. Flip a belief and let the evidence do the convincing instead of willpower alone. Shrink your options and let the friction do the creating. Borrow 5 sets of eyes and let distance do the clarifying. Sit in the dark and let silence do the focusing. Hold 2 opposing truths and let the tension do the maturing. None of it costs money. None of it needs anyone's permission but your own. It needs one thing: actually practicing it, starting today, not eventually, not once things calm down. Pick whichever one made you slightly uncomfortable while watching. That discomfort usually isn't a warning to avoid it. It's closer to a signal, pointing at exactly the one your mind's been needing most. Back to that riverbed from the very beginning. None of these 5 ideas change your circumstances directly. Not one of them hands you a new job, a new relationship, or a bigger bank balance by itself. What they actually do is cut a new channel in the mind, one small shovel of effort at a time. Once that channel runs deep enough, thoughts start falling into it automatically, the same way water always finds the lowest ground, without ever needing to be told where to go. That's the real difference between people who eventually build something extraordinary and people who spend years wishing for it instead. It was never about luck arriving at the right moment. It was digging quietly and consistently, long before anyone else noticed the work being done. Motivation almost never shows up first, if we're being honest. It usually shows up after the digging's already started, once the first small piece of proof appears, showing that something is actually working. Waiting for motivation before beginning is a little like waiting for a riverbed to dig itself. It won't. The digging comes first. The feeling tends to follow once the new path starts proving itself. A garden looks like nothing at all for the first few weeks. Dirt, some seeds, maybe a little green poking through if you're lucky and patient. Nobody stands over a garden in week 2, disappointed that it isn't a garden yet. They already know what's coming because they understand how gardens work. Minds work on a similar timeline, even though almost nobody extends them the same patience. The channel's being dug the entire time, even during the weeks that look like nothing at all is happening. If any part of this landed, share it with someone stuck inside an old story right now. Subscribe if this is your first time here. This channel exists to keep sharpening minds exactly like yours. Train the mind the way you'd train anything worth training. Deliberately, without waiting for motivation to show up on its own first. An extraordinary life was never about extraordinary luck. It's an ordinary mind, trained a little differently than most people ever bother to try. Nothing about today looks different from yesterday, probably. Same room maybe, same routine waiting outside this video, but one channel, somewhere in there, just got a little less certain of itself than it was 20 minutes ago. That's usually where it starts. Quietly, without anyone else in the room noticing a thing. Last one, tell me which of the 5 you're starting with, then leave this below. I dig my own path. I'll see you in the next one.